I'd like to welcome everyone. On behalf of the Berkeley Law School and the Center for Latin American Studies, I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. I'm Harley Shakin, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased, very honored with the Berkeley Law School to be presenting this discussion tonight inside the Chilean student movement. Inequality, public education, the privatization of education, the 99%. These are issues that certainly impact Chile and obviously go beyond Chile. This is the first public talk at a university in the United States of one of the leaders of the Chilean student movement. We're going to do this as a conversation. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Beatriz Mons.
Thank you. And I'm the moderator, so I'm going to be the main person saying to you, be short, be concise, because we don't have that much time and we want to get a lot of questions and comments in. And again, this is going to be in Spanish, and if you need to have translation into English, there's some equipment over there. So we are also, if you can ask a question in English, but go slowly because everything is being translated and taped both in English and in Spanish. So with that, I also want to welcome my fellow Chilean, Giorgio Jackson. And I'll start with the first question. Since I'm the moderator, I have the power to do so.
Maybe you could start with giving us an idea of how 4 years ago this movement began and how it came or how you arrived to this year. Do you hear me? Yes. Well, before anything else, I want to thank Beatriz for the invitation. It's been a while since she invited me. I wanted to thank everybody who is here for their interest, because I know that here you are also living a lot of similar matters, like in Chile, in funding cuts, increases in tuition, and so it's an honor for me to be able to share with you what's happening in Chile and to anticipate and to talk to you about a privatization of education. There are Chileans here, right? Yeah, that's it. I wanted to know if I needed to speak slowly, if they're Chileans. But yeah, please speak slowly because they're interpreting. Okay, I'll speak slowly. Many of the things I'm going to say, it may be familiar to you, but I think it's important to give a context of what has happened in Chile as how this movement, of this year particularly, has been born thanks to the accumulation of previous processes, and how this year there were many conditions that came together in order for it to be more empowered. And in this sense, the closest example to the student movement, like Beatriz said, is like in 2006, the movement called the Penguin Revolution of the secondary students, high school students who really had a lot of strength in the first year of government of a socialist president. And it changed the agenda completely of what that government had thought about doing, and this culminated in new legislation in 2008, which doesn't satisfy the students who feel betrayed by the political system. And the same students from 2006, or most of them, nowadays are present in the movement that starts a little bit this year, a movement of the reform to the higher education system. The diagnostic was very clear. It's not like this year we came up with a wheel, but that many previous studies had already shown how the Chilean education system, particularly of the higher education, was totally privatized, the cost of it, and how public education was dying year after year. The challenge, given the conditions of which I'm going to talk about, is how to ignite and how to make the citizens aware of these problems, because they were very complex. Please continue. So some of the factors that I think had influence so that this year would be a year of great mobilizations. One is that the students of high school were now at the university. The professor of mine came in. How embarrassing. Of course, the same students from 2006, by learning through these mobilizations, they have been preparing this movement in 2008. So it's a learning accumulated, which is difficult to quantify, but certainly there was learning. There was a lot of skepticism towards the system, which in the end allowed us to be less innocent, which we were probably in 2006. And in that sense, last year, the ones who ignite, the one who turned on the motor was basically the government, because the government said that in 2011 it was going to be the reform of higher education. They announced it. The ones who don't know, the government is a right-wing government. It's a government that within the coalition of the government, within the alliance with two parties, basically, there's a party which is much more identified with the Pinochet dictatorship. And so they have been the ideologists of the system in Chile, which started in the 80s. So there were a lot of reforms to the educational system and to the constitution. And so when a government who has that sector very present in power says that it's going to reform the educational system, we became afraid, because we thought that there were more privatization reforms coming. And at that moment, we felt like David and Goliath, against Goliath, because there was a sector that not only has the political power, but also a lot of great power in the media. And so how could we counteract that strength, and how could we make this citizenship aware of all this? And that's when a block of many people came together. Some of you would have heard of Confetch, and it's a very wide political spectrum. Certainly there were very few exceptions of people closely linked to the government, but within this sector, we could talk about people from the left and people from the center, but because the government was going to do these reforms, it made us focus on what united us and not what divided us. So I'd like to do the presentation because it can explain a little bit how the process came about. I won't say anything more. And the light. How about this one? The one down below? There. Yeah, you can see it well. This picture is from March this year, a march that had more than 100,000 people, and newspaper, they said it was like 50,000, but we know that there were more people there. It filled out the main avenue of the country, and so this picture is in front of the Palacio de la Moneda, of the presidency, the president's house. In this presentation, I put Chile, inequality, education, democracy, because this movement, we are going to be finding that, which many of you already know, because it muted before from something that became centered on education, and then it turned politically even more and more, and with things not necessarily related to education, and that's why it becomes stronger. Well, the context is 17,000 inhabitants on the way to development, and it's called the Jaguar of Latin America. They call the city, the country that has $15,000 GDP per year per capita, and so supposedly that's what comes into developed countries. But in the next slide, we see that it's very unequal. And these are dollars per month by divided in 5% of the population. If we could, in this 5%, which is the richest, if we could separate it in 5 pieces, the curve to upwards would be even more pronounced. The concentration of the wealth in Chile is one of the greatest problems we have, and that's why when we speak, and so I go back, when you go back to 15,000 GDP per capita, we are talking about that less than 5% of the population arrives or has that. The 95% of the population is below that. So you can imagine, maybe the ones who study math here, how concentrated the cake for very few. When I see Occupy Wall Street, I saw 99% and 1%. I was saying we are also like that. So looking at this inequality that not only is financial, as far as income, but also as far as opportunities. This is like a base of the diagnostic of that everybody had at the beginning of the movement, or to start participating. It's not, I'm repeating myself, but it's not like this year we discovered all the statistics and we came up with something, but it's an accumulation of a lot of movements who have gotten things right or in things wrong, and all the factors came together. And the prior things bring us to ask to see if we have to call democracy in Chile. The meritocracy, you know that because it's the American dream. So, for example, if you make the effort, you will do well. But that is absolutely false, because there are systemic conditions that make it impossible. There are many tricks. It's almost like you have a 100-meter dash, but you have a lot of obstacles, and it's you're running up and people are running, and other people are running down. And so this makes meritocracy false. And this meritocracy, or this concept of it, makes it so that those who don't have the opportunity or who don't achieve success, they feel like a failure, they feel dumb, they call them lazy, and it doesn't have anything to do with that. But many times, because you have no opportunities, and what makes it even worse, and it's not that it's anything bad, but maybe I'll try to explain why I think it's bad, but there are very few outliers who, being in the most vulnerable situations, they manage to overcome all obstacles, and they make it believable that this meritocracy system works. And they say, I did it, why can't you? And so that's why people become desperate, and so they feel like if my friend could do it and I can't, and so if I can't do it, it makes me turn into somebody who's a failure, who is good for nothing.
So that's the exception that confirms the law. So we have a system that is very unequal, and there's some cases where they are successful, but it can't justify, and it justifies the fact that it's working. It's only by asking where somebody was born, then you will know what possibilities someone will have in life. You're going to know what their average income they're going to have, where they're going to live, what school they're going to go to. There's a lot of conditions that you can learn by where somebody was born. And so that allows the system to reproduce itself. There's even a report from the OECD that put that the Chilean system is structured by social classes, and that is a verbatim cite. How does education influence in this context? I don't think that education is the solution to every problem. I think when they say education is a mother of all battles, it's an attempt to depoliticize people so that they only focus on one topic.
Yes, a little bit.
Poco más espacio. I feel that the discussion about saying that education is going to solve all the problems is going to get us back to the discussion about meritocracy, and it's going to exclude all the other variables in society that affect the development. But we can't say that it isn't one of the most important factors. So today is not meeting its goal. And I want to talk about one of the errors in the actual system. This is one of the critical points in the educational system. This is on a macro level, not quite so much in the politics in the classroom, but in the structure of the incentives. That's something else. We have inequality to access at every level, from elementary, from preschool to higher education, and not just as far as tuition, but as far as to which institution each child, each toddler can assist to higher education. The quality of the institution or in superior education is very different. It's also different in elementary school, and in elementary and high school, there's a problem that there's a voucher system where 93% of people can access in primary and high school education, and more than half can access a private system with a voucher from the state, and less than half can access the public system through the municipalities. But the voucher is for assistance, it's not for tuition. It's a small difference that also makes that a lot of schools don't have the sufficient budget. And in private education with subsidies, there's what's called a co-payment. So you can pay over the voucher a tuition, and that way the Chilean population is segregated. So there's people that can pay $10 over the voucher, there's those that can pay $20 over the voucher, up until, I think, $140 is the maximum. If I'm not mistaken, is it 140? So what happens is that if you correct for socioeconomic factors, the result of the different standardized tests of the different schools, you realize that public education, which doesn't have a co-payment, is of the same quality as a private education with a co-payment. So where do those extra resources go? Where are they going? The only reason for those resources is the segregation, so that my children can go to school with kids that are the same as my kids as far as socioeconomic situation goes. So classism makes it so that we have a segregated scale of schools for different public, for different audiences. There's low expenditure per student as far as the financial structure is the vouchers. There isn't a financial structure for the public school that can allow a certain degree of stability in the budget. It's totally marked by competition between public schools and between the public and the private schools. There's privatization of the costs, where the second, according to the OECD, where the country where families spend more as a percentage of total cost. So we are one of the countries that has more privatization as far as the costs go. This has been explained to me, and I had thought about this, but private education is not there to complement public education. It's quite the opposite. Instead of adding more value to the education, private education, you could think that they would generate new methodology in teaching methods so that it would have extra value. But maybe there would be religious schools. And maybe that way they could justify the fact that there's private schools to give it, there's a different value. But the subsidized private education is a commodity, is exactly the same as a public education, only with a different provider and without any type or very low regulation. To give you an example, let's imagine that we're in California. And there are public schools that meet all the demand. Everybody's there and everything fits perfectly. In Chile, there can be more private schools come into the system, as many as they want, and they're going to take away students from the from the public schools and the financing, because as we said before, it's structured with vouchers. So costs are the same for the public schools because it's the same classrooms, the same professors, and the resources are less. So that's what's happening. They're going to close some public schools, and then this year that's what's happening. Public education is not a priority. In higher education, families have a lot of debt. We call them the learned unemployed. These are people that can't find work in what they studied. 2/3 of people that finish higher education degree don't work in something that they study for. They work in something that has nothing to do with it. In Chile, well, higher education is very unregulated. You can start a major, a degree, anywhere you want. And in the end, the problem that we have is that we have 1 million students in higher education. And of course, you would want the poorest people shouldn't have debt, but then the state would have to finance institutions that are really bad. So there's a contradiction in what to do in public education. If the students are able to access the information, it's the same problem. Well, these aren't solutions. It's more of a diagnostic that you can't keep putting a patch on the education system in Chile. But this is a premise that we've talked about from the very beginning. That in the end, all of the previous movements weren't able to talk about the structural problems because the previous governments had political operatives within the societies. And they also had a discourse very close to the frequency where they would talk to actually the same things, but when they would talk about mobilizing each of the chambers, So between the two different parties, with the progressive people and the other people, they would have to reach agreement. So it was a type of patch for the system. The student movement has proposed structural reforms. Like I said, not so much in the classroom. I don't think that's... And the government resists to things that it calls radical. So what happened in 1981 is a lot more radical than what we're asking for now. The system we have right now is very radical. The fact that we want to establish a system is like European countries. I mean, if you look at analyze what we're looking at, it's just that. In the government or in the media, they talk about it as something that's very radical. And there's a politic of terrorism for... What? Yeah, politics of terrorizing, frightening people. People get scared that this is going back to the Soviet Union.
I'm going to go back to the eliminating municipal control over schools, and because public education is very bad, very unequal, and so schools work under that same mechanism. Therefore, a school that accepts a student of a rich person, it's not the same education that a person receives in a rural area who has all types of contributions. And so therefore, if the state want to offer a quality education to all, they have to take into consideration those differences. Changes in the structure of the schools. And so we are going to say this off the record, even though there's a camera there. But if you would look education as a production line, to say it politically correctly, like in any production line, there are variable costs and set costs, and so each one of the students is a marginal cost. But the problem of financing is that it doesn't consider each student as a marginal one, but as a total. There's not consistent financing or something that could be done with a voucher system. So what happens is that there's a complete voucher of an estimate of how much it would cost to maintain a school. It's something that can't be maintained. So if, for example, if students leave, the costs remain the same, and the financing that the institution receives is less. And so I don't know if there's a lot of evidence. Probably there are many studies, but it also applies that there are fixed costs and variable costs, and so they should be able to be mixed and not just by in variable expenses. So, like I said, there's a private sector in secondary education that can be installed anywhere, and where there is urban expansion, or how they're called in Chile, there are only private schools. There's no plan to create public schools. Given the different urban expansions. And the worst thing, like I said in the previous example, where there's public education, private institutions come there, and then they basically break these apart. And so in education in Chile, there is profit with the resources from the government in these private schools. In higher education, and that also happens. I mean, the universities, they're supposed to be not for profit, but in practical sense, there's a conglomerate where it says, so for example, in Lord International University, and so in Chile there are 6 universities, but the rest in the world they're a business, but in Chile it's kind of like charity. It's kind of a very strange thing. And so we want public education. So private education may have a contribution as long as it works with the government, and we say that we want that public education may be public and excellent in all levels, and that has been one of the main things. It's been hard for all of us to establish this banner because it's separate from this actual moment and for the resources that there are. And it's one of the matters that the government has attacked the most, and I'll explain why. So if there's private education, that it's at the service of the country, not governed by the market, so that there is a contract with public education so that it may work for the country. I have a picture of the protests. This is an occupation. Occupation? Oh, takeover. Takeover. Occupy or takeover? An occupation. This was called a thriller for public education. They called me. We need a Michael Jackson, and so there I was. Since I hadn't practiced, I was over on this side. This was in front of the Palacio de la Moneda, and so what we were saying is that public education was dying, and we wanted so thriller has to do with zombies and death. It was something popular, and there's a video. I invite you to see it. There are several of them. I love this picture because the mobilizations, there was a group of chemistry and pharmacy in Chile that what they did was medications with names related to so there's a play of words. Yes. So there's like a medication against a medication against coughing, which is. They're very difficult to interpret, but it's a play of words. There was a great creativity in these mobilizations, all the unhappiness, and it turned into a carnival, especially in the first months. Afterwards, and we'll be seeing the pictures, that there's also a lot of body paint, and it was, and we had the kissing for education. So people gathered to kiss each other for half an hour, protesting in a different way for education. And so anybody would protest that way. The mononucleosis after this was a great problem. But no, I don't know if you saw Dragon Ball. I don't know what this is called, but it was spectacular. And so you can imagine the production in each demonstration, which really involved the citizens. And so what we put on the table maybe was radical, or maybe it was to the bone, like we say in Chile. The family became so involved because it was something that was happening to them. It wasn't something made up. And they said, yeah, that's happening to me. I'm in debt. I went to school and it didn't help me in the least. All the diagnostics we were making were like for the family, and so that was why we had so much support for this movement. This is what we called 1,800 hours for education, and so the students ran for 1,800 hours around not only one person, but it was like a baton passing, and so we were taking turns. It was something fabulous. I went several times, but I didn't jog. I was with them, but I don't know. I guess I'm lazy. Police repression has been a fundamental matter in what the protests have been. Here, as you can see, after we're going to see groups that are violent, who reacted with violence, or some who went directly to do that. But what happened at the beginning in the first marches, 12th of May, and the other ones, the marches were very happy. It was like a carnival. Police repressed and used their force, police force, to disperse all kinds of meetings with tear gas or with like tear gas, and it's very toxic. It makes you cry. With the like water cannons, which also has chemicals in the water, and so there was a much stronger reaction by the students when they were repressed, because many who went to the protests, it was the first time that they were going, and the Catholic University, the one of which I was a president, it was a very conservative university. The students still go out marching. Is there anyone here from there? It's a university which is very conservative in general, but this year many went protesting. More than 1,000 people from there went to march, and so they saw that without doing anything they were repressed in the same way, and so they thought that only the person throwing stones was suppressed, and so they would go home and they would say we weren't even doing anything, and they were repressing us, and so that generated a lot of strength to the movement and generated a lot of strength because other sectors, social sectors, were becoming involved in these protests. There are pictures of people running with the police behind them. There are barricades, which is what's below here. That happened a lot. The movement each time was becoming more reactionary as far as police repression. I never have wanted to justify it, but I understand it. It must be, maybe a sociologist could explain it better, but it's something like, especially when you're not doing anything at the beginning, and you're fighting for something fair, and they repress you, well, and especially those who are the most affected by the system, and they feel like they are throwaways. And I read some flyers that there were some students who would wear hoods, like a hood, máscaras? Yeah, so they would wear hoods or masks, and there was a type of defense behind that those hoods, and it said, I'm a throwaway, I'm not good for anything, this is the only way I can protest, because it's very strong. I believe that they made that the citizens' support would go down, and there was no way we could control it, and it was in the minority. But many times, like in the next picture, we did things peacefully to show that we weren't participating in that, and in this. So here, there was a lot of gas. So they got about 300 tear gas cans, and they cost about $300 each. And so they made a peace sign, and they calculated how much money has been spent in that, and it was a huge amount. But it was something that it was truly incredible what was spent in that. This protest, which is the umbrella march, and so many people came out. It was raining. There was no violence afterwards. And there were no hooded people. There was nothing else like that. And here we had a lot of power because the few people who wanted to generate violence were put separate by the peaceful marchers, and they said not to participate. And this increased the citizen support, and we have had lows, but we have been able to gain strength by mistakes of the government, and also because of this type of march. There it says, no more repression, more education, and a woman says, I'm not afraid, are you? This especially after the repression. Let's see, what is this? There's a moment when, after 7 months of protests, more than 80% of support to the student demands, but we started to question democracy very strongly. Who should the government listen to? Is democracy a blank check where the check is elected and can do whatever they want during 4 years? That's what the same government decides. And yeah, the government was elected democratically, so why are you bothering them? They can carry out their governmental program, and we resisted that because we had a diagnostic that the citizenship felt was correct. And so this is something else, that there is too much stability in Chile, and so there's a binomial or a two-group party. There's too much conservatism to the changes. And especially this year, maybe even before this, there's an analysis of up to what point the unity has come, the one I spoke to in the beginning, and how it was affected. Because when you protest, when you do occupations at universities, especially this year they were in public universities and in public schools, you would think that the government, because they're the legal owner of the schools, that they would become worried. We have to fix something so that there's no more occupation. We need to do something. But there's a moment when time passes, there are no answers, no response. The dialogues we had with the government were useless, and we started to question about the pressure that we were doing through the demonstrations, and thinking that it would be doing harm to the government. Many of us started thinking that the occupations were actually working for the government, who had an agenda where they didn't care if it was public or private education, because they didn't think about quality. And so they said, I don't care. So they were saying, we don't care if there's public or private education, but what we want is quality. And so in Chile, there are very schools who are excellent, and they're very selective in who goes there. But the rest of public education is like penitentiary, just like centers. So unfortunately, it generates educational ghettos where public schools are the most vulnerable places, and they don't have a way to get out of there. So by ending with public education, and here, and I'm saying, well, maybe it wasn't that bad for the government. Maybe they weren't so interested in that, and so they could increase subsidies. So next year tuition is going to go up, and so especially when we hear the President of the Republic say that the fact that 70 children would repeat their school year, and they couldn't do anything about that. I don't know that it really mattered to them to solve the problem. And some of the answers they gave us, we don't care who provides education as long as they're good quality, and we want the parents to have the possibility to select. And that's what the freedom of choice. And that doesn't exist in Chile because the institutions are the ones who elect. They choose academically because there's a shared cost, also by special social conditions, demographic conditions, because there's no access, and so they select the business or the public. Many times they choose by if the parents are separated or not. Separated like as in their marriage. So what we present, and so the parents can actually have a choice. There has to be public education all over Chile, so of good quality, so that the parents can actually choose a good quality public education or private education, which has an additional cost. Not that it would be of bad quality. I'm going to be moving quickly here, especially higher education is profitable, and so that way is just so that each person pays their credit. And so this awakened the questioning, the model maybe of development, or at least a part of it, in which it's a society of save yourself if you can. So, for example, if you're profitable and you can pay your education, then you don't have to worry about anybody else. I don't care if the other person has an education or no, because I'm going to be profitable with my education. So there's a political problem here, and so maybe there are ways of having credit, and so that it could be efficient. In the OECD, they would show us that there are completely free programs which are very profitable for the state and for their taxes. And there are others which are more mixed, in which students have to make a payment. But the question is more political. How do we understand the government as something that is for all or for no one? So if I receive public education, in the end, I'm going to feel that I owe the state. And so when they charge me taxes, I'm going to pay them happily, and so on. And so maybe it's a more qualitative issue, which is not so evident. And so this is very funny. It has been the speech that has most affected the citizens. And so if you look by socioeconomic sectors, from the beginning of this speech, these have been the people who have left the student movement. We don't want the poorest to finance the richest people. And if we go back to this graphic, where one tuition can cost $800, even $1,000 a month. I think here it costs more here, but in Chile it's considered a lot. It's considered a lot. We can see that very few can pay it. So we're talking about the total income for this segment. They would have to pay all their income in order to go to higher education. These are a little bit less, and these others can pay a lot. But this part is only 5% of the population, so why not make it free for everyone so they can pay more taxes? In the end, for example, when they say that the poor are financing the rich, is when there's a system of taxation in a repressive way, but if it's progressive, the argument falls flat, because there the rich finance the poor, or at least that it's free for everyone. So there's a discussion. So even if we increase taxes, that becomes even more progressive. But then the question also arises, what happens with integration? We want to have quality education for everybody, for all the poor people together, or for all the rich together, or do we want to have interaction between the different sectors? So now we see that there's a problem when the government give these answers, which sometimes are very strong and difficult for us to counterattack, because the citizenship in general has no accessible information in a simple way, which it can have access to understand the problems. The support is effervescent and unstable, and so if they become bored with the marches, then they don't support the movement. So in Chile, there's no way to channelize the support. There are no referendums, there are no initiatives. What do you call them? Law, citizens. So, for example, if people can gather petitions, there's a way of petitions, and so the power of the people is lost. So 6-7 months pass, and the power is lost, and the status quo reigns. So the conservatism reigns. So people in Chile are very conservative inside. If we're fighting for 6 months, they say, "Oh, kids, go home." In the metro, they would tell us, "Oh, just stop doing that." Yeah, you don't need to be doing that. And so what I am convinced of is that here the problem is The problem is it goes beyond education. It's not, the changes are not going to be established this year or the budget ones. And the idea of a budget is simply for resources, but it could have been generated, some changes could have been generated regarding the education. But the true change that I think we're going to be able to make for different social problems, not only education, this year it's very empathetic for families to support changes in education. It's a change in democracy, in participation, in the way to understand the society in which we live. And probably if the health providers next year, the nurses, the unions of different health sectors, if they go protest, then they're not going to have empathy from the people because but how do we generate a democratic system through the citizenship so that they create pressures so that democracy works it meets the demands of the citizenship.
It's every 4 years in the elections because people in Chile don't pick based on an ideology. They vote on someone that they can trust, or the publicity that they have, or because of offers that they're getting as a consumer of the democracy. And if we are able to bring down the level of the information, to be able to talk about the ideological problems behind each social conflict, people will be able to vote based on the project that they want, not on the best offer. And I think that's where our democracy is going to be able to improve. And there's several things that we're going to need to improve so that everything can be more dynamic, so the social processes can be more dynamic. Changes in the Constitution to empower the people and for people to be more responsible, and change in it's a disaster the way political parties work in Chile, and more representation in Congress. And there's 2 blocks that it's very difficult to take away that inertia that they have. That's a summary of basically what happened this year. It's my own personal perspective, so that there may be a lot of critiques, and well, I think I went over on time a little bit. That was the first question. Is there a question? Or a comment over there in the back? Good evening. First of all, I would like to say congratulations for having been the leader in an awakening in our country, which is very needed. In our country. First of all, I wanted to ask you the projection, the end result that you see in all of this, since they approved the budget for the 2012. I don't know it very well. I know that it was delayed, but I haven't been able to talk about it with my fellow students here. What do you see as a final product as far as the movement goes, short-term and long-term? And what is the projection that you have? Your personal opinion as far as politics in Chile. What do you think you're going to be doing in 10 more years? Can you tell me who you are, where you study? Or? I live in Montesinos. I go to UC Davis. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions together, and then he's going to answer them. Who else has a question or a comment? Over here. Hi, Giorgio. Identify yourself. Maida Ferguson, student at Berkeley, doctorate student. One of the solutions that you propose is that there's more participation and more transparency in politics. And the diagnostic that I've made, having worked in research centers and in ONGs, is that it's been more than 5 years that that activity has been going on. There's been no impact on Congress. So why is your movement any different to what these research centers have been doing? Another question over there. Please identify yourself. Miguel Ordenes, I study here at Berkeley. Giorgio, you spoke about how there has been a demand in education towards a political demand that has a farther reach in our society, and that this movement has come about in separate stages. And next year, since there's elections, how does the movement want to project itself and capitalize this force, this public support, so that we can have some sort of lever in the elections? Okay, as far as what Diego is asking, and I'm saying this seriously, it's not like somebody elected the movement. If I would have been the leader of the movement, this would have ended in a month. I think it's been a collective effort that has been very important to be very humble internally in the conflict in order to all of us together build something together. So I think it's been creation. It's 100% from the collective. And next year, I think everything is very complex, because people get tired of these things. They get tired of seeing the same topics on TV every day. But this is something personal, but I think the projection for the movement will be if we can become involved in the political system and elections. I don't know if the automatic registration was approved. No, it was the last day. Okay. But I don't know if pressuring more is we're going to be able to bring about the change with this political system. There's a certain lowering in prestige. I don't know that it affects them in making decisions, the fact that they weren't very popular or that there wasn't that much popular support. I don't think government's going to care necessarily. I think we're going to have to win on the inside. The Miguel's question? How we can bring about those political change, how we can, in the next elections, in the elections for next year, I don't know how we're going to be able to do that, because they're the municipal elections and it's complicated. But there isn't a direct link to the municipalities as there can be with the presidency or in the parliament. There's a lot more where we can pressure there, I think. And I think this is something personal, but I think their political objective of the sectors from the center to the left that tend to be more democratic, so to speak, it can be to have 4/10 of the chambers. With that amount, you can change certain things of the Constitution, certain laws, and that can be an objective that can bring together certain wills and put aside many differences for a common objective. And I think this is interesting. With that, we can change a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of us that are willing to work towards that, whatever it takes. So that could be something good. And as far as what Mayra says, transparency, I don't know if you mean a citizen that's aware, something like that. Yes, I had seen something. There was a citizen observatory, this was what it was called. As far as participation from Congress and with citizenship, I think it's more the transparency in the parties. It's in the primaries that people are able to organize themselves. The parties don't have a lot of support. People don't like parties that are against. I don't know. They're not very appealing for some reason because they have some internal functional system that is not very avant-garde, not very transparent. There have to be new political practices, and these come from the parties, from the new parties, from the movements, and that's what I mean. That's what I'm referring to when I mean transparency in political, not so much in the legislative. Thank you very much for everything, and as a woman from Chile, thank you for everything that you're doing. I had two questions. First, to emphasize that at the beginning, there were a lot of people from high school that participated, and I think that was very valuable in the movement that they were included, that they were participating as well. I wanted to ask the fact that there is a lot of competition through incentives, and as far as the resources go, if that's been another obstacle in political cooperation. For example, my thinking between the universities, and related to that, can you talk a little bit about the cost of the mobilization for different universities? It's my understanding that there are some universities that are about to go bankrupt. As you mentioned, there are 70,000 students that are going to have to repeat the year. So, because the resources are very bad. But if you could give us an update on what have been the costs to the different groups.
If anyone would like to ask a question in English, you're welcome to do so there, I think.
Thank you. I just...
Can you identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Kajal. I'm a UC Berkeley student, undergrad in Peace and Conflict Studies. And I was hoping, since you've been involved in this in Chile, and as a student, I've been following Chile for a while. And since a lot of things had happened in the past few months on our campus and in United States, and since there are many, many parallels between Chile and United States and what's going on in education, if you can give us some suggestions, some ideas maybe, because ours is very similar but also very difficult. So I was hoping you can give us some ideas.
One more question in the back there. Yeah.
Giorgio, you spoke before. Oh, please. Me llamo. I'm doing a doctorate here at Berkeley. You talk a little about the different political parties and the movements within society in general, and you criticized Chilean democracy a little bit for that. And in other Latin American democracies, that's one of the principal channels for political demands from the people. What is your opinion on the possibility of joining a party, maybe of a concertation? Do you see that as something possible? Is there 4/10 in the chamber, or is there the chance that the movement can be institutionalized in the political parties? Hay otra pregunta acá. Good evening. My question
That's my question.
Look, so here we have the same problem. The leadership in education is
here we have unemployment of generations of students, inequalities in the financial sector, so like the 99%, the ideas of meritocracy, and also we are also trapped in what here they called American exceptionalism, in which at any age we can go back and study, and whoever takes the reins can come back and create a future. What counseling would you give us here in Berkeley when nobody is taking responsibility? And who do we address with these demands if the government says that it's the leadership in education and vice versa? And what do you study here? Sociology. What question did you ask about leadership in education with the students? What advice would you give to the students? Where do we focus our demands if nobody is taking responsibility? I didn't understand leadership, the chancellors, the administrators, the presidents, they're not taking responsibility, and so they send it to the government, and then the government sends it back. Okay, so now you're going to answer. The first question about the different incentives, and I don't remember who asked the question, and the there have been conflicts in truth, because in Chile, at least in higher education, we have something very strange, universities which are traditional, public and private universities, and private education. And so when we go and we look for public education, and so I go to a traditional university, we know that if we want to improve our education, and we know that there are preferences in the state universities, but also there are regions that where they can't differentiate like this, and at the end they want the demands be more in a corporative, so that there's no difference between their universities and the traditionals. So for example, who has the resources, if everybody fights in the way, if some fight more and some fight less. So, for example, we had 2 months. There was a campus occupied for 2.5 months. We have, I don't know, strikes in like 23 careers, and the other ones, it's been 6 months. So we had the privilege in this because of a different social context in the university. And so the costs haven't been distributed equally. And so if there is equal participation, and so there are some sacrifices that will not be compensated by the system, and so that will affect the future unity, because even though we have an ideal, many times deep inside people are very individualistic and they want their own progress. And you're not going to sacrifice yourself for the collective. So regarding suggestions, that's very difficult. I think that at least I saw here some videos of Professor Wright here on November 15th on the stairs. We saw that you are doing a lot of things here, that it's there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of budget cuts that probably that will have consequences in the costs and in budgets. The only thing I could suggest is that store that information and simplify it and write it in a very plain language so that everybody can understand it. We did in the beginning consider different types of people, like the privileged, that they should feel guilt because they're privileged. I always say it is kind of like a Catholic guilt. it's like a guilt that I was privileged, and so that's why I have to be responsible. And so those who are marginalized have to feel some type of anger because they are on the margins, and so there are different objectives, but have a message which is equal for very simplified, and that helps a lot to mobilize people and be very transversal. What I believe it was a very important to change the language of the educational system, because many times words are very charged, and so people don't like that. And so if you change it to something that means the same but it sounds friendlier, then people will tend to not like them. But if every protest has the same type of language and you haven't been successful in so people are going to think that you're saying the same thing. So simplify your language and make it simple, and decide who is your target audience, and invade the social networks. And I think that was it. To join political parties, I think, is impossible. And it's impossible because, I mean, they themselves know that they can't be believed. I don't know if you understand me. They know, as a matter of fact, they told us, we know that you're going to be in the newspapers, you're going to be hitting us. They know, because they feel, many of them, they're divided, that sector is divided between those who flagellate themselves, who hit themselves because they did things that they shouldn't have done according to their principles, and because they're very critical, and they're the ones who are more self-complacent. No, everything we did was what we needed to do. It was a context where we could, that was the only possibility we had. So it's very divided. And one more year, if something still exists that looks for programmatic objectives, we'll have to see. But right now, I don't see it as something possible. Even if you feel like, no, it's not, maybe closer to an ideological ideal, maybe more to the left. I don't feel. There are some sectors which are more to the left in the student movement. There's a wide range. But I don't feel at all identified with the Concertación, because I feel that they haven't been coherent. They have had the same bad practices of this government. And at the end, that breaks the links of trust. And so that's why I think it can't be done. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work for some things. For example, we were Congress seeing the budget law, and we were demanding these things. And so, of course, we had to do it and speak with them because they had the power. So we see that they didn't have so much power because everything is the same. But that's not the problem of the parliament. They don't have a lot to do with the budget because the regiment is very much for the president. And so if you reject the chamber and the Senate, and then everything stays the same. So the last, I can't remember, that nobody takes responsibility when the government shoots it over to the municipal charges. I think the responsibility is always divided and can be distributed. So what I would recommend is to attack both of them at the same time, so that way neither one can say, no, but I am talking to my director, but also speaking with the government. It's not that you're in favor of one or the other, but you have to change things. And so it's not to focus on the local government, but to attack all fronts at the same time. Well, time is finishing. One last question, very short. There are two. Two, but very short. We really had to leave at 7:30. Antonia from Berkeley, I wanted to ask, it's very interesting to me to join a political party, to become involved with a political party. Have you thought about establishing a new political party? Maybe a new it's a new movement. The student movement is new. Why become part of something that you are rejecting? Why not become part of something else?
Roger Burbach from Berkeley Center for the Study of the Americas, the nonprofit center.
Can you speak louder?
Yes. Can you did a very good job of presenting the situation of the origins of the student upheaval in Chile. How do you see that connecting either to other movements in Latin America or particularly on a global level in 2011, where we've seen everything from the Arab Spring, the movement of indignados, the British upheavals, and the Occupy movement? How do you see these being influenced or relating, or is this just a coincidence that we're seeing all these different movements? Where does Chile fit into that?
They're kicking me out here. Why not a political party? Because it would be disastrous. It would be even worse than the ones that exist nowadays, because we're all very different. Because, like I said, we're united because there's an objective, but there's not like a political party of the youth. I'm confiding in you. There's a Chilean singer. He would always call me and tell me that he kept always saying that we should have a young political party, but he used to call me all the time, but now I don't answer his phone calls. But so now there should be several political parties that should represent objectives, and so the Confech simply has coincides in the diagnosis of what's happening, but they will never create a political party that can be sustained. And that's very difficult. The connection with other social movements, I think that the Chilean movement was not influenced by external forces. We took several ideas as far as social networks, like the Arab movements, but I think it would have happened with or without them. What did happen is that a state generated where we felt that it did belong to us, because there were other movements also in the world. So if we had a movement and something else was also happening in Spain, in Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, or in Egypt, in Libya. Nothing happened in Saudi Arabia. I don't know why I said that. The Arab Spring, that's why. That at least makes you feel like you belong, and that everybody is doing something, that you're a part of something that transcends, but it's not a causal thing as coming because of them. I don't see any connection in the different movements. At least that's my personal opinion. ¿Y usted piensa que hay una interrelación creciente porque las cosas están sucediendo? El proceso chileno es único, pero hay una conexión. That I do believe there are interchanges or exchanges that can happen between the different movements, and so because different movements have come up and because they have similar factors, and so the exchange is good to exalt, share experiences, and so that the movement can be more effective, but I don't think it has one cause the other, but I think there is space to work that way. For example, the Spanish movement of the indignados passed from indignados to comprométete, and that step was very interesting, because I believe that a person can go to any part of the world, and it's not just in Spain, and it's not just of a particular place, but because people all over the world can identify with what's happening there, and so there's certain empathy with that.
Well, you won't believe that Giorgio arrived here in Berkeley around 3 p.m. today, and he's leaving for Chile tomorrow morning. So,
Así que, so I want to thank you profoundly. Thank you very much.